Okay, well, everybody, I'd like to welcome you to this Tipping Point event and to tell you that I'm Larry Goldberg, standing in for my colleague Barbara van Halle, who is currently braving the weather in Jersey, where it is raining and she's struggling to travel to Washington, D.C. So with that said, let me first tell you that we're going to be talking today about Smart Enough Systems, a book that has recently been published, and we have with us James Taylor, the author of the book, and Tom Debevoise, the CTO of Tipping Point, is going to be interviewing James. Now, this is a very important book, in my opinion. I have been studying it for the last couple of weeks and find something new and exciting on almost every page. This is not a paid advertisement. This is real, and I think it's a very important book today. It's a book of its time, and it's a book that I would have expected from James Taylor. James is the Vice President of Fair Isaac Corporation, and he's been developing the themes of enterprise decision management there for several years. I guess he's seen many systems that are smarter than most and the value they bring to companies as well as the technologies and approaches that make them possible. James has experience in all aspects of software development, including designing, developing, researching, and marketing application development, technology, and platforms. He writes many articles and frequently presents at trade shows and conferences. And as an aside, I frequently quote him at many of the appearances I make from many of the appearances I've seen him make. He's a very quotable guy, and I'm sure you'll pick up a lot of wisdom today. You can visit his blog at www.edmblog.com, and he also contributed chapters to the Business Rule Revolution that Barbara and I edited, and to Business Intelligence Implementation Issues and Perspective. And just before we have James come on, let me introduce Tom Debevoise. Tom is a good friend of mine as well. He's a highly successful technology consultant and co-founder, originally co-founder of Business Knowledge Systems and now CTO with Tipping Point. Tom is the author of a very well-selling and a very exciting book, BPM with a Business Rules Approach. And if you haven't read this book, this is a really interesting read. It's a very constructive, very instructive, and a book that if you're interested in BPM and you know something about business rules, or if you're interested in business rules and want to know something about BPM, I would highly recommend. So with that said, let me start by having Tom join us and begin his interrogation of James.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to thank you all for showing up on such short notice. James, could you briefly describe the new approach you have laid out in this book?
Sure. The idea is that by focusing on operational decisions, the sort of high-volume transactional decisions that take place in your day-to-day business processes, and by managing them, focusing on their automation and on the long-term improvement of them, you can dramatically improve the intelligence, the smarts of the systems you have. And that the reason, one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason why we feel information systems are so dumb much of the time is because they rely completely on people to make these decisions. And so the systems themselves are incapable of making a good decision, or if they do make a decision, they make a poor one. If they once made a good decision, it's degraded over time. And so the decision-making capabilities of systems is too weak. And the approach is about combining business rules and analytics, something we call adaptive control, the sort of scientific, systematic improvement of a decision over time, to focus in on these decisions and automate them so that your systems become smarter.
And what are the key technologies in this architecture that you're proposing?
Well, there's really sort of two main technologies and sort of a couple of approaches that aren't really sort of technologies in their own right. The first is really this focus on business rules. So this idea that a business rules approach, business rules management systems represent a a fundamentally better way to automate these decisions. That traditional software tools do a poor job of automating decisions for a number of reasons, and the declarative, much more sort of business-friendly approach that you get out of using business rules represents an ideal platform for automating decisions. However, if you think about people making decisions, we don't rely only on policy manuals and expert judgment. Increasingly, we look at reports, we look at historical data, we try and see what that data would tell us so that we can make a better decision. Well, to do that in an information system, you have a problem because information systems can't read reports. They don't do OLAP cubes very well, and they don't even want to use Excel. And so in order to turn the data you have collected about your business into something that your systems can use, you have to focus on executable predictive analytics. So that's the second technology, the technologies of data mining and predictive analytics that help you turn the data you have into a model of typically the future, a model that represents insight, if you like, that can be executed by information systems. So those are the two main technologies, but you also need a focus on decisions. There was a great quote some 50 years ago now by one of the founders of Fair Isaac. He said, if you want to improve a decision, you have to grab it by the throat and not let go. And what he means by that is that if you don't separate out the decisions and focus on them as unique opportunities for improvement, you won't improve them. It's a little bit like saying you can't improve a business process unless you think of it across all the different systems and people and departments that are involved in it. You have to think about it as a separate entity if you're really going to improve it. But decisions are just the same. And though that's not a technology, clearly it's easier in a service-oriented world, in a world in which people are modeling business processes more effectively. And then the last sort of piece of this, which again is not really a technology, is this notion of adaptive control. The idea that you should build into these decision-making components, these decision services, the ability to constantly refine them, try new approaches, and see which ones work best. And that's a necessary component because the reality about decisions is that they don't stay the same. So a good decision today will not necessarily be a good decision tomorrow. Business world changes, your market changes, your competitors change, the law changes. And so you need constantly to be able to change a decision. And that's a big change for many IT departments because if you think about programmers and code, they regard code they have to keep going back to as code that was written wrong. And decisions aren't like that. You have to build a decision in the expectation that it will change for the whole lifetime of that particular piece of automation. And so adaptive control, building into those decisions the structure you need to systematically test them and improve them is a sort of another key concept. So there's sort of two technologies and two key concepts, if you like, that go together to make up the approach.
So, I mean, this is a fascinating area, but a lot of the practitioners and the groups that we work with today may not even realize where their decisions are. There's also a lot of discussion in things like Harvard Business Review and some of the other books about the maturity of the organizations that are involved. Are you familiar with KPI's rules maturity model, and do you find customers are immediately moving into predictive analytics and enterprise decision management, or do you think there's a process for getting there?
There's definitely a process, and I am familiar with the rule maturity model. I think there's really three different places where people are approaching enterprise decision management. You see people, first of all, who are using rules. So they're moving up the rule maturity model. And you're right, they're not people who are just getting started with business rules. They're people who have had some initial success with business rules. They're trying to move into an environment where they're managing those rules, managing those decisions more aggressively. They're starting to think about how they might evolve them over time. They're beginning to regard them as a sort of a competitive asset. And two things happen at that point. They realize they need an infrastructure for constant improvement, the adaptive control piece, and they start to think about how they could move beyond sort of judgmental and sort of policy-driven rules and into rules that can be derived from the data they have. They start thinking about analytics and data mining as ways to enhance the rules they have. And because clearly there's a limit to how much, how precise you can get with your rules if all you're relying on is individual judgment. There's an analytic component of how we do things these days that's a reality if you want to get to a certain level of precision. So you do see a group of people moving up the raw maturity model, moving up the maturity curve, and starting to add analytics into a rules-based environment. Interestingly, you also have a group of people who have historically built risk models, insurance, banking, credit, and so on, whose focus was on data mining and on predictive analytics, and who in the past have created code to implement those models. And that was fine when the models lasted months and months, but now they're finding that they need to change those models more often. They have more models, and they still have the same problems of needing to combine those models with rules, policies, and regulations. And that's driving them to say, I need a better platform for automating my analytics. If I need sort of industrial scale in the decisions that I'm trying to apply analytics to, I need a platform for automating those decisions that enables me to both rapidly change my models, but also include other aspects of decision making. So you also see a group of people moving up from data mining and predictive analytics, even from business intelligence into those environments, starting to say, gosh, if I really want to apply all this data I've collected to running my business better, then I have to be able to change my systems. It's not enough for me to just push information out to everybody. I have to use this data to change my systems, and I can't do that if I built my systems the old way. I have to focus in on using business rules and decisions if I'm going to create a platform for using the analytics. And then there's a sort of third group who haven't really approached business rules or analytics in the past, who are focused on often on the sort of CRM problem. How do I make my customer experience, my customer relationship management systems more effective? How do I use all that data I've now collected about my customers and build a better experience for them? Who are perhaps adopting these things more in parallel, but in a very sort of localized decision-making space to start with. And so they're starting with very simple decisions and very simple rules and simple analytics, and expanding both more or less in parallel, and starting to see a few people adopt enterprise decision management who haven't really got into rules or analytics in the past, who are focused on sort of customer-focused decision-making and how I get better at making customer treatment decisions.
So like a very quick path to it, based on that CRM.
Right. Right, but starting with typically, because if you look at people who are heavy users of rules or heavy users of analytics, they've typically started with decisions that are a big deal. We often joke when people ask us, and I've talked to Larry and others about this too, when you ask successful rules projects, did they have to do an ROI calculation, it's often fairly straightforward because the consequences of not doing it were so awful. The same thing's true in analytics. Many of the early adopters of data mining and analytics had a terrible consequence of doing it poorly. So in those circumstances, you adopt technology fairly aggressively. And when you're talking about customer treatment decisions, the difference in a good one and a bad one might be very, very small. It's only significant when you apply it over the very large number of decisions you make. And so they tend to start, with a sort of a small scope, but applying both technologies in parallel.
So in your book, you're suggesting that these very high volume, low cost decisions are kind of hidden in a lot of organizations that may not be as obvious as the ROI you suggest.
Right. Indeed. One of the big challenges as we wrote the book, and it was interesting about writing a book, as I'm sure you found too, is that there's some things you didn't expect to have to describe that you ended up describing at much greater length than you expected. And the sort of nature of decisions was one of them. When you work with people, particularly risk-focused people, they're very aware of the risk-centric decisions they take. When you start talking to people who aren't risk-centric, you start talking about these customer treatment decisions or other interactions, it becomes a real challenge to find those decisions for some people. They don't think about decisions. And again, I'm reminded of the sort of analogy with business process. You know, some business processes are easy to spot, but sometimes it can be hard to separate the systems you have or the departments you have from the actual business process that you're trying to execute. And so finding some of these decisions can be a real challenge, and it can be a challenge because people have historically not had the option to think about them as decisions, and so they've made the same decision for everyone. If you think about a kiosk or an ATM, and you put your ATM card in, there's absolutely no reason why how the ATM looks when you put your ATM card in should be the same as how it looks when I put mine in. There's no reason at all why a decision could not be made about how to display the ATM for me versus how to display the ATM for you. But typically that's not what people do. When you call a customer service line and you get the set of voice responses, you know, press 1 for this and 2 for that and 3 for the other, they already know what your phone number is, and they probably have a pretty good sense of that it's you if you have an account. So why would they ask you if you wanted to take an action on a kind of account you don't have? But they don't think about that as a decision. They don't think about making a decision for each customer as to what options to display or what offer to make or how to print their bank statement. They think of these things as a one-time decision for everybody, and they need to think of them as an opportunity to make a decision customer by customer.
So getting back to maturity a bit, or getting there, at a lower level of enterprise maturity before we have this predictive business agility, you think the current methods of business rules approach addresses decision management? You know, we have 2 prevailing approaches. There's Ross and Van Halle. Are these approaches adequate for positioning decision management as that company becomes more mature?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if your place to start is with business rules, then I think certainly you can take the kind of approach that Barbara and Larry and others have been talking about and apply it to designing business rules for a decision. I think we as an industry have more work to do in terms of helping people find the right kinds of decisions to apply business rules to. Though there is some in this book, there's some in Barbara's book, and some in the Business Rules Revolution, and there are many places where we talk about this. But I think we need to sort of ramp up our focus on decisions and on decision management as the sort of the reason you're trying to apply these technologies. But yeah, I think that if you're starting from a business rules approach, there's plenty of information about how to use business rules to automate decisions that you can apply. And similarly, if you want to start with analytics, if you read Berry and Linoff or any of the classic data mining predictive analytic books, there's plenty in there about how you go about bringing these things to bear. And we didn't try and replicate that in the book because there is a lot of good material out there. What we were trying to do was say, there's a slightly different focus that can be applied here that's worthwhile and brings together some of these threads, perhaps in an unexpected but certainly in a new way, to try and solve a class problem. But yeah, I don't think there's any reason why someone who's looking into business rules as a start point, or indeed already working with business rules, shouldn't feel that they can use those approaches very successfully to get well up the sort of decision management maturity curve. I think that's a perfectly good approach for many organizations.
But it seems to me that like the decision or the focus of the decision is the end point of the rules is kind of implied in these methods, but we're going to have to make some adjustments to really maybe make the decision as the starting point and focus down into the decision service that you describe in the book.
Yeah, perhaps. I think so. In some areas more so than others. There are places where when people apply business rules, they focus on the decisions almost sort of naturally. If you think about someone using business rules in the claims processing space, they're thinking about, is the claim valid? How much of the claim should I pay? What follow-up actions should I take? And that's what they're automating with business rules. And so even implicitly, they're already thinking about those 3 decisions in the life cycle of a claim. And I think in many of the places where you see business rules having historical success, insurance, credit, banking, there's natural decision points that are highly visible, very clear to people. And so if you went and looked at 100 people using business rules in insurance, they are doing decision management because that's a natural thing. They're very decision-centric industries that have adopted rules early. I think when you start looking at newer opportunities for business rules, I do think there is a need to focus more on decisions because I don't think the decisions are as clear to people. And the people you're working with are more process-oriented and don't find it as natural to think about the decision points within that process as unique opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, we see that a lot in some of our practice. We find that they implement the rules as a step in the process, and if the process gets complicated, the rule might be somewhere downstream in the process, and it's contributing to a decision up here, and you can end up with a pretty complicated-looking process.
Indeed. I mean, that's one of the classic ways to find decisions is to sort of, the two things I always find interesting when I look at some business process diagrams in particular. I love the ones where you have a diamond that says something like, is a customer a good customer or not? You're like, well, that's a relatively complex decision for some organizations, and not one that stays static either. Perhaps you're lucky and there's some flag in your database that just says, yes, they are, no, they're not. But the reality is if you were really thinking about that as a decision point, it's not a zero-time decision. It's a relatively complex one. And so focusing in on how you make that decision can be just as productive as focusing on what you might do differently if someone was a good customer. And I think the other one is, as you say, is where you have a process and you know there are decisions in there, but they've become so mixed up with the process steps that the process becomes ungainly because it's got little bits of decisions scattered everywhere.
Yeah. I'd like to move on to another area that I've worked in, and it's the data warehouse. And, a lot of people had tremendous investments in data warehouses that kind of give you a backwards look at operation. But we know unless you've connected these facts to the decision and ergo their supporting rules, the benefit of this, particularly from the standpoint of decision analytics, can be limited, very limited anyway. Can you tell me how EDM and analytics supports the connection between the facts in your data warehouse and these decisions and business rules?
Sure. I mean, if you think about the data you have and what you're trying to do with it, you are always trying to influence the decision. Most data warehousing and sort of reporting projects have been focused on how you can influence a decision that a person makes, a knowledge worker or a manager or someone like that. And what's interesting is that, even if you look at the reporting side of things and you look at the kinds of reports coming out of the Data Warehouse Institute or from the big data warehouse vendors, there's a move towards what I call predictive reporting, the idea of giving people reports that have predictions in them, not just backward-looking data. And those same techniques that are used to do those kinds of things can be applied if you're trying to focus on operational decisions. And what I see sort of the change in mindset is away from saying, here's the data we have, how can we present it to someone in the most useful format, and sort of turning that around and saying, what decision are we trying to influence, and what would influence that decision productively? And if you take that mindset, you can apply that to both manual decisions, where you've made an explicit decision as a company that you're going to allow this decision to be made by this kind of person, and then your data warehousing analytics team's job is to say, how could I help that person make that decision more effectively? And you can also apply it if you're focused on automating a decision. If you say, here's the decision I'm trying to influence, and it's embedded in this, I'm going to automate it, then you can say, okay, well, what can I provide to that decision to help it along, make it easier to write the rules, if you like, for that decision. And that may be as simple as providing data. But it may also say, gosh, if I could say, can I use this data to classify customers into different groups? Can I use this data to make a prediction about the likelihood of some event in the future? And if I could do those things, could I write different rules? Could I make my decision differently? And so you have to sort of turn this around and start saying, what decision am I trying to influence? And therefore, what data do I have that might influence it? Or what data can I get from outside my firewall that might help me influence this decision? And so there is a sort of change in mindset required, but I think there's a lot of potential value. Certainly companies that have invested in master data management and customer data integration of one kind or another, if they've got their data under better control, if they have more up-to-date information that they know how to make available, and they've done a good job of sort of keeping track of where their data comes from and all the rest of it, will have a much easier time applying analytics to their operational systems. There's no question about it. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. There is a change in mindset, but if you look at the data mining and predictive analytics literature, all of them without exception will say, never apply any of these analytic techniques unless you know what it is you're hoping to change. Figure out first what it is you want to change, and then figure out how you can apply analytics. And in an EDM sense, it's the same question, but a little more focused. Figure out what operational decision you're trying to influence, and then build something that the code or the rules that are implementing that decision can execute from your data.
This would be a different kind of environment that we're going to build over, I guess, the next few years, because if you look at something like Business Objects or Cognos, and you have your query tool or your managed query environment, you have some data in there. Maybe you have a customer discount column, right? You'd want some way to present to the analyst who's looking at that the rule set that was applied to, say, the customer discount or some particularly important metric.
Yeah, that's an interesting area. One of the things that becomes an interesting sort of point of integration here is that if you start, first of all, if you've automated decisions, then the notion of adaptive control, of constantly viewing and refining your decisions, requires you to have a good sort of business intelligence, sort of performance management environment that helps you understand what's going on in the decision-making process. So you're right in the sense of being able to say, gosh, here's the trends I'm seeing in my customer discount. Is that an expected or an unexpected one? What can I do about it? And trying to sort of turn that performance management into some kind of action so you can monitor what's going on, decide you don't like it, but then be able to go somewhere and change those rules. So you're right, being able to link reporting and analysis tools into the decision-making process so that that's more of a closed loop. So instead of just showing a manager a report and having them go, I don't like that, that looks bad, and then having no way to change it, putting them in an environment where they can say, I don't like it, and therefore I'm going to go change the rules that drive that within the scope of control that I have. It's interesting to me how often I talk to companies or see demonstrations, and I remember one particularly at Oracle, and they were showing me this great demonstration of how a company had instrumented a process so effectively that they had near real-time data as to what was going on. And I said, oh, that's great. And if it came out that some aspect of one of the systems they were instrumenting needed to be changed because of the results they were getting, how long would that take them? Well, it was a traditional piece of code. It would take them, the normal 3 to 6 months. So you have real-time data about something going wrong, but it's still going to take you 3 to 6 months to change it once you know it's going wrong. So it seemed to me that they were completely over-investing in monitoring something and under-investing in their ability to control what they were monitoring. So I do see a sort of rebalancing of that. Say, okay, if you really need to monitor something in real time, then you need to be able to change the system that you're monitoring in real time too, or at least in close to real time, and sort of getting people to focus on both sides of that equation. And that is a change and will require companies to think about an additional level of infrastructure so that when people can see what's going wrong or what's going right, that they're able to go make the kinds of changes that they need to respond to that.
So you believe that the kind of analytics you're discussing is going to replace large swaths of reporting and things like OLAP? Will it be the primary reason organizations collect data?
I'm not sure it will replace it. I think it will. Well, let me rephrase that. I think there are organizations who think that the way they're going to get more value from their data is to push traditional BI or app reporting tools to an ever-increasing number of people. And I do believe that enterprise decision management is a more effective tool for improving the performance of frontline staff than that. I think it's much more effective to focus on the decisions that are being taken by those frontline staff, deciding whether you really want them to take the whole decision or if you really want them to pick between two or three options, and focusing in on how the data you have can drive that decision-making process, rather than simply delivering ever more information to people who are on the phone with your customers. So I do think in that sense, some of this focus on the democratization of BI down to people who have very transactional-oriented jobs is inappropriate. And that enterprise decision management can and should replace some of that use of BI. I don't think it will replace it amongst knowledge workers and amongst managers because I think they're solving different problems. I think we'll see more of an integration, as we spoke earlier, in the sense that part of what you will be reporting against is the performance of the decisions. And that will be part of how managers control their business and how people can see what's going on in their business and then know they can go change that in response. And I think part of the attraction of enterprise decision management, even for knowledge workers, is that many of the sort of professionals I talk to, take the classic one is insurance underwriters. I talked to a company that had been applying this for a while, and they couldn't remember the last time they'd had to hire an underwriter. They'd had a couple retire, they'd grown their business, but the slack, if you like, all that extra work had been picked up by the automated system. And he made an interesting observation. He said that now he had underwriters who would spend some time using their analysis tools to understand what was going on in a particular town or a particular part of the country, and then go visit the various agents who worked in that territory to help them understand why, what opportunities they might be missing. Perhaps they had a customer portfolio for this agent who had a much lower average number of products than this other agent over here, what was going differently, help them understand demographics. So use all that analysis that they had provided all these analysis tools to actually understand their business more effectively and go and change the way the business operated. And he said it's not that they have new reports, and it's not that they have new skills as individuals. It's simply that the automation of the basic underwriting decisions in 90, 95, 98% of the time means that they can now leave the office or stop working on their transactional stuff for a few days, focus on the business, and not come back to an enormous stack of unapproved policies, because the vast majority of policies are now being approved automatically. And so part of focusing on decision management is this ability to then create opportunity for the people who have this BI, OLAP reporting environment to actually use it, because they're no longer swamped with the sort of day-to-day transactional stuff. So there's lots of ways in which the approaches are complementary, but I do think we will see less of a focus on pushing BI tools right out to the sort of very front line of an organization, and more of a focus on how you can automate those decisions at the front line, so that the people at the front line don't have to review reports and don't have to do analytic things.
I'd like to move on to the service-oriented architecture a little bit. And we talk about decision services, and you do in the book, your book a bit, and this is kind of a term that's drifted up from a lot of different sources. But how are decision services like or unlike other services? And the thing that really interests me is part of the SOA approach is to publish these services through a UDDI registry. Do you know of any firms that have taken that approach with decision services?
Yeah, I mean, there are some organizations who have adopted decision services who are very focused on moving everything to UDDI and to a sort of, a sort of like a pure service-oriented approach. And they have done that. And we've had some interesting discussions with a couple of partners who have more advanced, repositories of one kind or another, about how you might extend some of that. Because one of the things about a decision service is typically that you understand and can present to somebody much more of the innards of a decision service because it's declarative, it's driven by rules and analytic models that have a very sort of declarative orientation. And so one of the interesting questions is not so much can I expose decision services to other consumers the way I expose any service, because you definitely can. The question that's sort of becoming interesting to some of these folks is how do we extend the process and the way in which people go look for useful services when the useful services they're looking for are decision services, and we can therefore tell you much more about them and allow you to sort of analyze them more intently before you consume them. And so I think there's a really interesting space around that. I do see probably more customers still adopting decision services as a sort of mental model, deploying a service-oriented component, a real service through UDDI that implements that decision, while at the same time deploying the sort of logic and the models to other platforms. It's very common for decision services to be the one cross-platform component that's really essential. If I've got a pricing module, a pricing service, perhaps not all the systems that need to know the price are service-oriented yet, and so I need to be able to deploy that decision service both as a service through my registry, but also as a piece of COBOL code or as a Java component to pieces of my architecture that are not yet service-enabled. So I think you will see an increasing use of standard registries and UDI and so on for decision services, because I think you'll see that in general for services. I think there is some interesting potential for how you can extend that if the services you're looking at are decision services. And then I think there's will continue to be a need to regard decision services as not just a physical implementation, but also a sort of logical implementation that can be spread across multiple platforms.
So, because if you think about it, if we shoot out 5 years or something, and a lot of folks have done this or experimented and come up with a successful way of publishing these, you're going to lighten up the process structure even more. Because, so at some point we could visualize maybe even like a fifth wave of process integration, which is more semantic in nature, that some people have alluded to over time, where your processes know the decisions that they need, they know how to access them, and
right.
And you could get an amazing amount of agility from that standpoint.
For sure. And one of the interesting things we've been playing with here at Fair Isaac, and I'll give a sort of shameless commerce warning at this point, is a thing we call ScoreNet. And part of what we're trying to do is create what we call a decision service provider model. The idea that you could have decision services essentially hosted externally so that people who needed a decision made could simply ask the network for it and get a response back. And that it would handle the execution of rules that were required by regulation, perhaps allow you to layer on your own rules in a sort of ASP-like way, and would know what external data sources, data about consumers, data about geography, location data, was necessary to make a good decision. So you could imagine an environment where instead of saying, gosh, I need to know if this particular location is on a floodplain, or there's been a fire in this building before, and a bunch of things that you might get from external data sources, and instead say, I need to know, I need the decision about the riskiness of this property made. and you could simply pass an address and get back an assessment of risk that perhaps you had customized, but perhaps was entirely standard, because you're getting access now to these decisions rather than just your data. And I do think you're right that this, one of the interesting things about decisions is this ability to package them up and make them very clear. And so I do think there's a real potential for that. And the semantic work that's going on and some of these things around how do you host some of these things gets really interesting and can get you to a point where your process is very transaction-centric. So instead of saying, here's my process, here's the first step, and then the second step and third step, you say, okay, here's a transaction that's sort of inbound, a request for something from a customer. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decide, I'm going to just make various decisions about that transaction that will enable me then to essentially assemble a process to execute that transaction. So making the whole thing very data-centric, very transaction-centric rather than process-centric. We'll see how that goes. It'll be interesting to see if organizations can flip their thinking to be that sort of assembled on demand, or whether they're going to continue to require some infrastructure, process infrastructure to use those things.
So, just my last question, and as I ask my last question, I'm going to go ahead and poll the audience. I believe I'm going to drop back here. How do you see all of this with the focus? I mean, there's a very intense focus on business process and business process management. And how does this relate? Do you see that there's a coming ground shift, or we hope there's a coming ground shift? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm sorry. Someone got set off there. All right.
Yeah, no, I got the question. Yeah, so the question about how this sort of fits with business process and business process management and the current focus there, I do think there's a very strong parallel. I think as people move business process management out of what you might call the sort of very dynamic sort of high process change environment and start to use it more and more for core transactional processes, I think the need to automate decisions in those things becomes greater. I think when you think about the sort of the historical roots of many BPM environments, you've got the sort of application integration piece of it, you've got the human-to-human piece. As you start applying some of these technologies to processes that are a real mix of systems integration and people-to-people integration, I think people are going to find that many of those processes bog down around work lists for people, and that automating those work lists out of the process using only a process approach is going to get them into real trouble. And so they're going to need to focus on those decisions and say, instead of just saying, I'm going to wait at this point for someone to make a decision, can I make that decision and only put a very small percentage of those transactions onto someone's work list, or indeed not have the work list at all and route everything automatically. And as you focus on that aspect of process management, I think the recognition that decisions are important in getting a high rate of straight-through processing and getting processes to be more effective will become more obvious. I also think as people worry about compliance more and more, and you see a lot of talk about the use of business process management to demonstrate compliance, if you think about many of the kinds of regulations that are out there, many of them relate to how you make a decision about treating a customer or a prospective customer. And so I think the focus on decisions and being able to demonstrate that a decision is compliant will also become important. And so I do think you'll see those things evolving in parallel. I think the growth of business process management is driving a growth in an interest in analytics and in rules. And I think what I hope is that people will realize that the most effective way to sort of bring all that together is to focus on decisions, not just as something that happens as they're going along in a process, but something that matters to the business. And one of the things that I say in the book is you think about the decisions you make. When a customer gets the consequence of that decision, they think you mean it. They think you meant it deliberately. You know, I know, because I know how banks work. When I get a piece of credit card junk mail, I know that I got that because I happen to belong to a segment that has a reason.
All participants have been muted.
Sorry. Go ahead.
All participants have been unmuted.
Go on.
It's okay. So if I get a piece of junk mail, I know that I just happen to belong to a segment that has a reasonable chance of a response rate, because I know how banks do their mailings. But most people, when they get a piece of junk mail from a bank, think to themselves, good grief, why is this bank sending me this useless piece of junk mail, particularly when it's their own bank? The customers react to the decisions you make as though they were deliberate, conscious, targeted decisions. And I think, I hope that companies will realize that if they really want to improve their processes and their systems and their customer treatment, they're going to have to start taking those decisions as, you know, and actually managing them and thinking about them that way as well. Because if they don't, there's a huge mismatch between their customers' reaction to their decisions and how they make those decisions, and that will get them in trouble.
Yeah, an associate of mine has a practice called the angry customer practice, and he's, you know, it has a fairly good practice, and his job is to go around and work with organizations that essentially have lots of angry customers. And I thought it was very. I want to talk about it probably in one of my next BPM Institute submissions. But that's what he does. He focuses in on those types of things that you described, where the corporation just treated this person in some type of way, what they thought was a deliberate way, and ended up, creating the angry customers.
Right, because most organizations don't mean to annoy their customers or treat them badly, or fail to give them a discount they should have given them, or whatever. Another classic example is, many of the people on this call are probably frequent flyers, and we all know that if you call a frequent flyer program or an airline and you don't get the answer you want, you ring off and you call back, because the odds of getting the same answer twice are vanishingly small. Because that decision is not managed, it's not controlled by that organization, it's left entirely up to the people you happen to speak with. And you happen to get someone who's in a bad mood, they won't do it. And you call back and you get someone who's just had lunch and feeling, all's well with the world, then you might get what you want. But as an organization, that's a awful indictment of the decision-making capabilities.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think we have some... okay. Larry, do you have any follow-ups, or is anything that you'd like to ask?
The most interesting, or one of the most intriguing things that James is talking about is how the process is going to trend back towards the transactional focus rather than the process focus. And that's always a fraught question for me, because we always look at the issue of process with a bleak eye, because often we see transactions or decisions intermingled with process in a very difficult to unravel way. And what is intriguing to me in the book, what was one of the most intriguing parts of the book to me, was when James discussed the relative value of improving process versus the potential value of improving decisions. And I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit, James, just to focus on that point.
Yeah, I think there's clearly, there's no question that a focus on process can result in huge benefits for an organization. We've all seen the ROI numbers. Some of them can be terrific. But I think a lot of that, when I read these stories, always strikes me as eliminating what you might call sort of, abject idiocy, the really stupid stuff, and creating something that's at least functional. And clearly doing that gets you a huge return. I think what I see, though, is I see a lot of these things will fail to continue to deliver increasing returns unless there is also a focus on decisions. I think, very quickly, once you've eliminated, the sort of obvious idiocy, then you get to the point where if you're going to continue to improve the process, what you really need to do is improve the decisions within it, and that over time that will become a very high value piece of a process. I think also that if you start taking a more decision-centric point of view on some of these things, you can also radically reshape some of your processes. Because if you push the decision-making earlier in the process, you might find you can eliminate huge swaths of process for some of your transactions simply by taking your decision early instead of running through the process and taking the decision as and when it happens. To Tom's earlier question, if you've just got bits of your decisions scattered through your process, then you're almost committing yourself to running the whole process for every transaction. If you gathered those things up and put a sort of decision-making focus at the beginning of a process, you might find that for many of those customers, you're going to reject them, or you're going to accept them, or you're not going to need to do this or not going to need to do that, and you can therefore eliminate big chunks of processing for many of your transactions. And I think the potential return for that for some organizations is huge.
Thanks very much, James. Tom, do you want to open the lines for questions from anybody who's on the line?
We're not set up for that. So if there are any questions, I apologize. That's the particular limitation of the Nets folk. What
I would say, though, is that you're going to post this on your blog, and people are free to, can always post questions in response to it, and I'll make sure to answer them, or they can email me questions or post questions on my blog, and I'd be happy to answer them there, too.
Okay. If anyone wants to send us, use the Q&A section. I know that Luke asked, my friend Luke from up north in Canada asked the same question, are we going to have it on the blog? It will be. It'll probably be Wednesday before Nets people get the recording out there. So I think.
Tom,
go ahead.
Can you mention the URL of your blog, because I did not at the introduction, and perhaps.
All right. The URL is tomdebbovoice.com.
And that is spelled
DEBEVVICTOROISE.com. Tom Debbie Voice.
And James, could you just reiterate your blog's URL?
Sure, it's edmblog.com, so Enterprise Decision Management Blog.com, edmblog.com. You can also find links to it and stuff on the book site, which is just smartenoughsystems.com.
So I think this has been a Smart Enough seminar, and there won't be a blog called smartenoughseminar.com, but the seminar will be available on both blogs that we've mentioned, tomdebbovoice.com and edmblog.com. And we thank you all for having joined us, and thank you mostly to Tom for the excellent questions. And I warned you all it would be very quotable, but thank you very much, James, for your outstanding responses.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. Bye.